The woods have always been my escape. Ever since I was a kid, I found comfort in the solitude of nature. It's quiet, the whisper of leaves in the wind, the scent of damp earth after rain. Growing up in a crowded city, I always longed for open spaces, somewhere untouched by the constant noise of human existence. As I got older, my love for the outdoors turned into a habit. Whenever I had the chance, I would rent a remote cabin deep in Pennsylvania's forests, far away from paved roads and city lights. Just me, my backpack, a notebook, and the wild. It was my retreat from the world, a place where I could breathe, unwind, and let the quiet settle into my bones. I had been going to the same area for years. The trails, the streams, the rusted old signs nailed to trees. I knew them well. There was one particular path I liked to hike, a winding trail that cut through thick pines and led to a small clearing where an abandoned hunting cabin stood. It was a small, single-room structure made of dark, weathered wood, with a sagging tin roof and a rusted chimney sticking out like an old man's bent finger. It had always been empty. Every time I passed by, I'd stop for a moment, peering through the broken windows at the dust-covered interior. The place had been abandoned for years. No furniture, no signs of recent visitors, just a forgotten relic of another time. I always found it eerie but fascinating, like the remnants of a ghost town swallowed by the trees. But one evening, everything changed. It was late October, and the air had taken on the crisp bite of impending winter. I had driven up to my usual rental cabin, a small, modest place about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. No electricity, no running water, just a wood-burning stove and a few old gas lamps. Perfect. After settling in, I decided to take a walk before sunset, following my usual path toward the abandoned hunting cabin. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted through the undergrowth. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, familiar and comforting. As I neared the clearing, I expected to see the cabin in its usual forgotten state. But this time, something was different. There was smoke rising from the chimney. I stopped in my tracks. The cabin had always been empty. For years, it had been nothing but a rotting shell. But now, there was a thin wisp of smoke curling into the evening sky, proof of a fire burning inside. I hesitated. My first thought was that maybe some hikers had taken shelter there for the night. But that didn't make sense. The cabin had no door, just an empty doorway with splintered wood where a door must have once hung. No one would willingly sleep in a place that exposed. And then I saw him. A man stood just outside the cabin, tending to a small, makeshift grill. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. His boots were scuffed, and his thick beard was flecked with gray. Around him, empty beer cans were scattered in the dirt. He turned slightly as I stepped closer, but he didn't acknowledge me right away. I wasn't sure what to do. It wasn't illegal to be here. This was public land, and I had as much right to walk this trail as anyone. Still, something about the situation felt wrong. I cleared my throat. "Hey there." The man finally looked up. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, before turning his attention back to the grill. "Didn't know anyone was staying here," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He flipped whatever he was cooking, something dark and charred, and muttered, "Keep it moving. No food here." His words made my skin prickle. I hadn't said anything about food. I hadn't even looked at his grill. Something in my gut told me not to push the conversation any further. I gave a tight nod and started walking again, moving past the clearing and back toward my own cabin. But the feeling stayed with me, a gnawing unease that I couldn't shake. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin settled uneasily in my mind, every gust of wind outside sounding too much like footsteps. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the man was just some drifter or hunter passing through. Maybe he'd be gone in the morning. But when I hiked the same trail the next day, the smoke was still rising from the chimney, and there were more beer cans. Something about that place felt wrong now, tainted in a way I couldn't explain. I stayed away for the rest of my trip, avoiding that section of the woods entirely. A year later, I returned to the same rental cabin, bringing my wife, my sister, and a close friend along for the experience. I told them about the strange encounter, but by then, it felt like a distant memory, something I had overthought in the moment. Still, when we decided to go for a hike, I led them in a different direction, steering clear of the abandoned hunting cabin. But the woods have a way of leading you where they want you to go. Somehow, we ended up near the clearing anyway. The cabin was empty again, its doorway gaping like an open wound. The fire was long gone, and the only sign that anyone had been there was a pile of rusted beer cans scattered in the dirt, crushed and sun-bleached. A strange silence settled over us. My wife shifted uneasily, glancing toward the trees as if expecting to see someone watching. My sister wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing at the sudden chill in the air. And then we saw it. Just beyond the tree line, almost hidden in the shadows, was a single, fresh beer can. Placed carefully, deliberately, like a message. We left immediately. I haven't been back since. I never thought I'd be involved in a missing person case. I'd read about them. Stories of people vanishing into the woods, some found weeks later in places they had no reason to be, others never seen again. I always figured they were unlucky, maybe careless. I told myself that could never happen to me. But the thing about the woods, about the deep, untouched wilderness, is that it doesn't care about what you think you know. It was late January when I got the call. A group of hikers had rented a few cabins deep in the forests of upstate New York, in an area known for its stunning winter landscapes and heavy snowfalls. I wasn't part of their group, but I had been staying in a nearby cabin, alone like I preferred. I had spent most of the past few days enjoying the solitude, my wood stove crackling as the snow piled up outside. The call came from the owner of the cabins, an older man named Bill who had lived in these woods his whole life. He knew me well enough to trust my judgment. "Something's wrong," he said. His voice was tense, clipped. "One of the girls staying in the cabins is missing. Wandered off in the middle of the night, didn't take a coat, nothing." That got my attention. In these conditions, even an experienced hiker wouldn't last long in the snow without proper gear. Hypothermia could set in within minutes. I threw on my coat and boots, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, a sharp, biting wind that cut straight through my clothes. The sky was dark, snowflakes drifting lazily under the glow of my cabin's porch light. Bill's cabin was only a short walk away. When I arrived, I found a group of people huddled inside, their faces pale and drawn. There were 6 of them in total, 3 guys, 3 girls. They looked like they were in their early 20s, probably college students on a winter getaway. One of the guys, a tall, athletic-looking kid with a beanie pulled low over his ears, stepped forward. "I'm Jake," he said. "Our friend Mia, she's gone." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Tell me exactly what happened." Jake exchanged a look with the others before answering. "We were drinking last night, playing cards, just hanging out. Everything was fine. Mia wasn't acting weird or anything. But at some point, she just got up and walked outside." "She didn't say anything?" I asked. One of the girls, a redhead with tear-streaked cheeks, shook her head. "She just left. No coat, no shoes. It's like she wasn't even thinking." A cold knot formed in my stomach. That didn't make sense. Did anyone see where she went? Another guy, his hoodie pulled up over his head, spoke up. "She headed toward the trees. We didn't even realize she was gone for a while. We thought she just went to the bathroom or something." Bill exhaled sharply. By the time they started looking, her tracks were almost gone. I turned to the window, looking out at the thick snow-covered woods. It had been snowing steadily for hours. If Mia had gone missing in the middle of the night, any footprints she left behind would be long buried. The forest was huge. The temperature was dropping fast. If we didn't find her soon, we wouldn't be looking for a missing person. We'd be looking for a body. "We need to start searching," I said. Jake nodded. "We've already checked around the cabins, the trails nearby. Nothing. Then we go deeper." We split into 2 groups. Bill took 3 of the kids, while I took Jake and the red-haired girl, who introduced herself as Lauren. Armed with flashlights, we headed into the woods. The search. The trees stretched high above us, their branches heavy with snow. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional whisper of wind through the pines. My breath came in visible puffs as I swept my flashlight across the undergrowth. The further we went, the less untouched the snow looked. There were disturbances here and there, places where something had moved. Not footprints, not exactly. Just patches where the snow had been disturbed in a way that made my skin crawl. I crouched down, brushing my gloved fingers over one of the marks. "Something's been through here." Lauren shivered, hugging herself. "An animal? Maybe." I didn't believe that, but I didn't say it. We pressed on. The deeper we went, the heavier the feeling in my gut became. It wasn't just the cold or the exhaustion. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name. A wrongness. The woods were too quiet. No distant calls of owls, no rustling in the underbrush. Just silence, thick and heavy. Then Jake stopped suddenly, his breath hitching. Look. He pointed ahead, his flashlight beam catching something hanging from a tree branch. A scarf. Bright red, fluttering slightly in the wind. Lauren gasped. That's Mia's. I walked toward it, my boots sinking into the snow. The scarf was tied in a neat knot, secured to the branch at eye level. Not dropped. Not caught on a branch. Placed. I untied it, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't frozen, which meant it hadn't been here long. Lauren clutched Jake's arm. What the hell is going on? I didn't answer. My pulse was hammering now, my grip tightening around the flashlight. Something was ahead. I could feel it. We moved forward, and the forest seemed to press in around us. My breath felt too loud in the stillness, my heart beat a drum in my ears. Then I saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the snow. My first thought was that we had found Mia. Relief surged through me. But then my flashlight beam hit her face, and my stomach turned to ice. She was standing barefoot in the snow, her skin pale as death. Her lips were parted slightly, her breath misting in the cold air. Her eyes were the worst part. They were wide, blank, staring at nothing. She wasn't shivering, wasn't moving, just standing. Lauren let out a small, strangled noise. Mia. Mia didn't react. I took a step closer. Mia, can you hear me? Nothing. She was barely dressed, just a thin sweater and leggings. Her feet were red and raw from the cold, but she didn't seem to notice. I reached out slowly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Her skin was like ice. That was when she moved. Her head snapped toward me so fast that I jerked back. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a single terrible moment, there was something in them, something not right. Then she collapsed. Jake lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. I helped him lift her, hoisting her up between us. Her body was stiff, unyielding, but she was breathing. We turned and started back the way we came, moving as fast as we could through the deep snow. Mia never spoke. Not once. Not even when we got her back to the cabin. Not even when she warmed up. Not even when we asked her what had happened. She just sat there, staring at the fire, her red scarf still clutched tightly in her hands. I never found out what happened to her that night. Neither did she. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. My partner, Andrew, and I had been together for years, and this trip was meant to be a break from the constant pressure of our jobs. We had adopted our 7-year-old daughter, the previous year, and she had quickly become the center of our world. Living in Boston was exhausting, and this was our chance to breathe, just the three of us away from everything. The drive to the New Hampshire woods had been long but scenic. The trees grew denser as we drove, the paved road eventually turning into gravel. Our rental cabin was deep in the woods, a place recommended by a colleague who swore it was the most peaceful place on earth. We arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin was modest but cozy, sitting in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The wooden structure had a wide front porch, a stone chimney, and a small dock that extended into a lake just a few hundred feet away. There were no neighbors in sight, just the wind through the trees, the scent of damp earth, and the sound of wind giggling as she ran toward the water. Andrew and I unloaded the car. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A single-story layout, one bedroom for us, another for one, and an open living area with a fireplace. The kitchen had all the basics, and there was even a bookshelf filled with old paperbacks. Perfect, Andrew said, stretching his arms. I smiled, watching Wind pick up pebbles by the water. This is exactly what we needed. I had no idea how horribly wrong things would go. The first night was peaceful. We ate dinner, played board games, and tucked Wind into bed. Andrew and I sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Eventually, we turned in for the night, lulled to sleep by the sound of crickets outside. The next morning, Wind woke up early and went outside to explore. I made coffee while Andrew took his time waking up. Then I heard voices. I stepped onto the porch and saw Wind standing near the edge of the trees, talking to someone. A man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in an old flannel shirt. His dark hair was cropped short, and he had a neatly trimmed beard. He stood several feet from Wind, his hands resting on his knees, as if trying to appear friendly. Alarm shot through me. "One," I called, striding toward her. She turned, her expression neutral. "Daddy, this is Leonard," she said, pointing at the man. The stranger smiled, but there was something off about it, too wide, too forced. "Good morning. I didn't mean to startle you. My name is Leonard." I positioned myself between him and one. "What are you doing here?" "I'm very sorry for the intrusion," he said. "I need your help." I glanced toward the cabin. Andrew was stepping onto the porch, watching us. "Help with what?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Leonard's expression shifted, his brow furrowing. "I know this sounds strange, but I need you to make a difficult decision. A sacrifice." My stomach turned. "You need to leave." Leonard sighed. "I wish I could, but we don't have much time." The words sent a shiver down my spine. Andrew joined me, standing close. "What's going on?" Leonard looked at us with something like pity. "Before I explain, my friends will be arriving soon." "Friends?" Andrew repeated. Leonard nodded. "3 others. Sabrina, Redmond, and Adrian. They're on their way." I took Wen's hand. "We're going inside." "Please," Leonard said, his voice pleading. "I know how this sounds. But what's about to happen? You won't believe it. And I'm so sorry for that." I didn't respond. I ushered Wen inside, locking the door behind us. We debated calling the police, but we had no cell service. Our only option was to drive away. But before we could pack up, we saw them coming. 3 figures emerging from the woods, carrying objects in their hands. I felt sick. They looked like ordinary people. An older woman, a stocky man with red hair, and a woman in her 40s with a determined expression. But they weren't carrying weapons, exactly. Makeshift tools. One held something that looked like a club fashioned from tree branches. Another had what looked like a crude axe. We barricaded the door. Then the knocking started. "Please," Leonard's voice came. "Let us in. We don't want to hurt you." Andrew grabbed a fireplace poker. "What the hell do they want?" I didn't know. For nearly an hour, they waited outside, knocking, speaking softly. Then, without warning, Redmond, the red-haired man, began slamming his shoulder against the door. The wood groaned. "We need to do something," I said, my voice shaking. "Like what?" Andrew snapped. Wen whimpered. Then, with one final hit, the door burst open. They stormed in, grabbing us before we could fight back. They weren't violent, at least not yet, but they were strong. Leonard held Andrew back, while Adrian restrained me. Wen screamed. "Please," Leonard said, his voice strained. "Just listen." I struggled against Adrian's grip, but she didn't budge. Redmond, breathing heavily, stepped forward. "We don't want to do this." "Then don't," Andrew yelled. Leonard exhaled, eyes full of sorrow. "One of you has to die." Silence. I felt like the floor had vanished beneath me. "What?" I whispered. Leonard's hands trembled. "One of you has to choose. A willing sacrifice. If you don't, the world will end." I wanted to laugh, to scream, to tell them they were insane. But they believed it. I saw it in their eyes. Redmond turned to Leonard, nodded. Then, before I could react, Redmond dropped to his knees. "I'm sorry," Leonard whispered. And he raised his weapon. Then he brought it down. I screamed. Redmond crumpled, blood pooling beneath him. Wen sobbed, burying her face against me. Leonard's face was pale. "That was the first," he said. "But it's not enough. You have to choose." We refused. Over and over, we refused. But they stayed. One by one, they sacrificed themselves. Sabrina next. Then Adrian. Each time, Leonard's sorrow deepened. As the night dragged on, the sky outside changed. Dark clouds rolled in. The wind howled. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Leonard, the last one standing, looked at me with exhausted eyes. "Please," he whispered. "I don't want to be alone." Andrew and I held Wen between us, refusing to speak. Leonard exhaled. Then, gripping his weapon, he did what the others had done. The silence that followed was deafening. The storm outside roared. The cabin shook. And we sat there, holding one, waiting for the world to end. But morning came. The sun rose. The world kept turning. And we were left to wonder if it had ever been in danger at all, or if madness had simply come knocking at our door. We had been planning this trip for months. A cabin deep in the Tennessee woods, far from the city, no cell service, no distractions, just a week of drinking, hiking, and letting loose. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Mark, his girlfriend Lisa, her cousin Jake, and Jake's girlfriend Emily. Mark had found the place online, some rundown rental that cost next to nothing. The owner didn't ask many questions, just told us where to find the key and warned us to be careful of wild animals. That should have been the first red flag. The drive took nearly 6 hours, most of it on winding roads through thick forest. The last half hour was pure dirt road, full of potholes and barely wide enough for Mark's SUV. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows over the clearing. The cabin itself was old, built from thick, weathered logs. The windows were covered in grime, and the front porch sagged in places. But it was bigger than we expected, with 2 floors and a small attic. Behind it, a narrow path led deeper into the woods. Mark shut off the engine, and we all piled out, stretching our legs and taking in the quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. Creepy, Lisa muttered. Mark grinned. Perfect for a horror movie. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and damp wood. The furniture was ancient, thick wooden chairs, a stone fireplace, bookshelves lined with old leather-bound books. The kitchen was stocked with rusted pots and mismatched silverware. Jake was the first to find the door to the basement. It was tucked away behind the staircase, a thick wooden door with a rusted latch. "Looks like a murder dungeon," he joked. He pulled the latch, and the door creaked open. A wooden staircase led down into pure darkness. The air that wafted up was thick with dust, and something else, something rotten. "We have to check it out," Mark said, grabbing a flashlight. I hesitated, but followed. The steps groaned under our weight, and the further we went, the colder it got. At the bottom, the flashlight beam swept across the basement. It was larger than expected, the walls lined with old shelves. Rusted tools hung from nails. Then we saw the table. A thick, wooden table sat in the center of the room, its surface covered in deep scratches. Chains hung from the ceiling above it, rusted but sturdy. Beside the table, an old tape recorder rested on a wooden stool. And next to that, a book. Jake picked it up. "Dude, this looks weird." It wasn't just old. The cover was thick leather, stitched together with what looked like crude string. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in handwritten symbols and strange drawings, some kind of language none of us could read. Lisa shuddered. "Let's put it back." Mark, of course, ignored her. He pressed a button on the tape recorder, and a crackling voice filled the basement. "The ritual is nearly complete. The darkness stirs. They are coming. They are." A sharp, high-pitched shriek cut through the static. Then silence. Emily turned to go. "Nope. We're done here. We should have left the book. We should have left the cabin. But we didn't. That night we drank. We laughed. The weirdness of the basement was forgotten as the alcohol kicked in. At some point, Lisa mentioned hearing something outside. A whisper. We brushed it off. It was a windy night, branches scratching against the windows. By midnight, everyone was asleep. I woke up to a noise, a low creaking sound. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The front door was open. I stumbled out of bed and into the main room. The door swung slowly in the breeze. Outside, the trees stood like towering shadows. Mark stirred on the couch. "Dude, what's up?" The door. A branch snapped outside. Something moved just beyond the tree line. Not an animal. Not a person. A shape, tall, wrong, shifting in the dark. And then it was gone. Mark cursed, locking the door. "Just the wind," he muttered. But his hands were shaking. Neither of us slept after that. The next morning, Lisa was gone. We found her outside, standing at the edge of the woods. Her back was to us, her head tilted as if listening. "Lisa." She didn't move. Mark rushed forward, grabbing her shoulder. She turned, her eyes wide, unfocused. "They're whispering," she said softly. "They're so loud." She wouldn't say anything else. By noon, she seemed better. She laughed, said she didn't remember going outside. We forced ourselves to believe her. Then Emily found the footprints. They led from the trees to the cabin. Not just Lisa's. Something else. Bare, misshapen prints. Deep. Clawed. That night, it got worse. Lisa woke us with screaming. We found her in the kitchen, clawing at her own skin, blood dripping from her arms. Her eyes were wild. "They're inside," she sobbed. "They're inside my head." She convulsed, body jerking unnaturally. And then she laughed. Not her laugh. A deep, guttural sound. Mark grabbed her, shaking her. "Lisa, stop." She turned to him, smiling. Her teeth were wrong. Too sharp. Too many. Then she attacked. It took all of us to hold her down. She was stronger than she should have been, her nails ripping into our skin. Jake grabbed the book, flipping through it desperately. "There has to be something in here." And then she stopped. Went limp. Her head snapped toward Jake. Her mouth opened, but it wasn't her voice that came out. "You shouldn't have come." We ran. We made it to the car, shoving Emily into the back. The engine wouldn't start. Something moved in the trees. Shapes shifting in the shadows. Eyes gleamed in the dark. Lisa stood on the porch, smiling. "You can't leave," she whispered. The whispers rose, swirling around us. Inside our heads. Inside our bones. Then Emily screamed. A hand, long, gnarled fingers, was reaching through the window, grabbing her hair. Mark punched the gas. The engine roared. The car lurched forward, knocking Lisa aside. We didn't look back. We didn't stop driving until the sun came up. At a gas station miles away, we finally pulled over. Lisa wasn't with us. We never found her body. Weeks later, the police went to the cabin. They found nothing. No book. No tape recorder. No Lisa. But the cabin? It was still there, waiting. And sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear her voice, whispering. I never believed in ghost stories. At least, not until the night we spent in Blackwood Forest. It started as a simple adventure, 5 friends looking for a thrill. I was always the cautious one, the voice of reason, but something about this trip pulled me in. Maybe it was the challenge, the promise of uncovering the truth behind the legend, or maybe I just didn't want to be the one who chickened out. The legend was well known in our small town. Deep in Blackwood Forest, hidden away from the well-trodden hiking trails, was an abandoned cabin. No one knew who built it or why it had been left to rot. The rumors ranged from a reclusive hermit who went insane to a family who had vanished without a trace. Some said people who went looking for it never came back. It was a story that had been passed down for generations, whispered around campfires and in hushed tones at sleepovers. We all thought it was just that, a story, until we found the cabin. It was a cool autumn afternoon when we set out. The group consisted of me, my best friend Kyle, his girlfriend Amanda, her cousin Jake, and our mutual friend Sarah. We packed light, flashlights, a few snacks, and a couple of pocket knives, just in case. None of us were particularly experienced hikers, but we had a rough idea of where we were going based on old maps and vague directions from online forums. The forest was beautiful, the kind of place that made you forget how close you were to civilization. Tall, ancient trees stretched toward the sky, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. At first, the hike was easy. We followed a well-worn trail, chatting and laughing, but as the hours passed and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the atmosphere shifted. The trees grew thicker, the air colder. The sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by an eerie silence. "We should have reached it by now," Amanda said, glancing at her phone. No signal. Kyle unfolded the map we had printed. "We're close," he assured us, but his voice lacked confidence. Sarah shivered. "This place feels wrong." None of us disagreed, but we weren't about to turn back. Not yet. We found it just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the treetops. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined, just a single-story wooden structure with a sagging roof and broken windows. The wood was dark with age, the door hanging slightly ajar as if inviting us in. Ivy crawled up the sides, nearly swallowing the building whole. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We made it," Jake said, breaking the silence. Kyle grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's check it out." We stepped onto the creaking porch, our flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. I hesitated at the threshold. Something about this place felt unnatural. "I don't think we should go in," I said. Kyle laughed. "Come on, man. What's the worst that could happen?" We stepped inside. The air inside was thick, musty. Dust coated every surface. The room was small, just a single open space with a rotting wooden table, a rusted stove, and a few broken chairs. There was a fireplace on one wall, its bricks blackened with age, and a narrow doorway leading to what must have been a bedroom. "This is creepy as hell," Amanda muttered. Sarah ran her fingers over the table, leaving trails in the dust. "It's like no one's been here for decades." Jake wandered toward the bedroom. "I'm going to check in here." The moment he stepped through the doorway, the cabin groaned. It was a deep, unsettling sound, like the wood itself was protesting our presence. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Kyle shrugged. "Old place. Probably just settling." Jake's flashlight flickered, then went out. "What the?" His voice cut off abruptly. Then we heard it. A low, raspy breathing. Jake stumbled back into the main room, his face pale. There's something in there, he stammered. Don't mess with us, man, Kyle said, but his voice wavered. I'm not messing with you, Jake snapped. Something's in there. I shone my flashlight toward the doorway. The bedroom was empty. Dusty floorboards, a collapsed bed frame, nothing else. And yet, the breathing continued. Slow, deliberate. As if something was standing just beyond the reach of our lights. Amanda whimpered. Let's go. The moment she spoke, the front door slammed shut. Sarah screamed. Kyle rushed to the door, yanking on the handle. It wouldn't budge. It stuck. Jake pounded against it. Help me break it down. I turned back toward the bedroom. My flashlight flickered, then cut out completely. For a split second, in the pitch darkness, I felt something move. Something was in there with us. Panic set in. We slammed against the door, desperate to escape. The cabin groaned again, the sound deep and guttural, like the forest itself was breathing around us. Then the whispering started. Soft, unintelligible, like voices carried on the wind. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Make it stop, make it stop. I grabbed Kyle's flashlight and aimed it toward the bedroom. The doorway was empty, but the breathing was louder now. Closer. Then the door burst open. We didn't hesitate. We ran. We didn't stop running until we reached the main trail. The forest was still eerily silent, but the cabin was far behind us. Only then did we realize Sarah was missing. We searched for hours, calling her name, but there was no trace of her. When we finally made it back to town, we went straight to the police. They combed the forest for days. No sign of her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The authorities ruled it an accident, said she must have gotten lost. But we knew better. Something took her, and we never should have gone looking for it. The idea of spending a weekend alone in a remote cabin had seemed appealing at first. I had been feeling overwhelmed by work and personal matters, and the thought of escaping into the silence of the wilderness for a few days felt like the perfect way to clear my head. I had rented a small, rustic cabin deep in the forests of northern Montana, miles away from the nearest town. The place was old but well-maintained, with a simple wooden porch, a stone chimney, and a single dirt road leading up to it. It sat on the edge of a dense pine forest, with a small clearing in the back that sloped down to a quiet, glassy lake. The drive had been long and exhausting. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the towering trees. I turned off the engine of my truck and sat for a moment, taking in the deep quiet of the woods. There were no city noises here, no cars honking, no distant chatter of pedestrians, just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of birds settling in for the night. I grabbed my backpack and stepped out of the truck. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Unlocking the cabin door, I stepped inside and took a quick look around. It was small but cozy, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with an old gas stove, and a single bedroom with a large window facing the forest. I unpacked my bag, setting my essentials on the small dining table. Flashlight, matches, a hunting knife, and a paperback novel I had been meaning to read. I had no cell service this deep in the woods, but that was part of the appeal. No distractions, just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. As I was setting up, I suddenly became aware of the eerie silence that had settled over the forest outside. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping insects had faded, replaced by an unnatural stillness. I glanced out the window, seeing nothing but the darkening woods stretching endlessly beyond the clearing. Shrugging off the uneasy feeling, I went about preparing a quick dinner. By the time I finished eating, the sky had turned completely black. With nothing else to do, I decided to step outside for some fresh air before heading to bed. That was when I saw it. I stepped onto the porch, wrapping my arms around myself as a cold breeze drifted through the trees. The only light came from the half-moon above, casting pale silver beams through the branches. The forest stood dark and silent, a wall of shadows stretching out before me. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, a shape caught my attention. A figure standing motionless among the trees, just beyond the clearing. My breath hitched. It was too dark to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was a person, tall and unmoving, positioned between two large pine trees, just standing there. A deep sense of unease settled over me. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded too loud in the silence. No response. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. A shiver ran down my spine. There were no other cabins nearby, no hiking trails that ran through this area. Whoever this was, they had no reason to be out here, standing in the dark woods, staring at me. I felt an instinctive urge to retreat, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a lost hiker. Maybe someone had wandered too far off a trail and ended up near my cabin. I cleared my throat. "Are you lost?" Again, no response. The figure remained completely still, as if it were carved out of the darkness itself. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any details, just that unnerving, shadowy shape watching from the trees. Something about its stillness unsettled me. It wasn't natural. Then, as if responding to my thoughts, the figure slowly stepped backward into the trees, vanishing into the darkness without a sound. My stomach clenched. I strained my eyes, trying to see where it had gone, but the woods were too dense, too shadowed. It was gone. Heart pounding, I hurried back inside the cabin, bolting the door behind me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A trick of the light. My eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe it had just been a tree stump or a weird shadow. But deep down, I knew better. I double-checked the locks on the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller, the walls pressing in around me. Every creak of the wooden floor, every rustling noise outside made my pulse quicken. I decided to sleep with my hunting knife close by, just in case. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. Then, just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard it. A soft crunch. A footstep. My body stiffened. The sound had come from outside, near the porch. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another step. And another. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving closer. A chill ran down my spine. Someone was out there. I sat up, gripping my knife tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. Silence. I forced myself to move. Slowly, carefully, I slid out of bed and crept to the window, pressing my back against the wall. My heart was hammering so hard I thought whoever was outside might hear it. After a long moment, I took a deep breath and peered out the window. There was nothing there. Just the empty porch and the dark forest beyond. I swallowed hard. And then I saw them. Muddy footprints on the porch, leading directly to my door. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife and listening to every sound. But whoever, or whatever, had been outside never tried to get in. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I had already made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up my things quickly, throwing them into my backpack with shaking hands. My gut told me that staying another night in that cabin was a bad idea. As I stepped onto the porch, the footprints from the night before were still there. Muddied impressions leading up to the door, but none leading away. A shiver crawled down my spine. I hurried to my truck, tossing my bag into the passenger seat. As I climbed in and started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That was when I saw it again. Standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the clearing, was the same figure. Watching. Waiting. But this time, as I stared, it slowly raised one hand and waved. A cold dread settled over me. I slammed the truck into gear and tore down the dirt road, not looking back. I never found out who or what that figure was, and I never returned to that cabin again. It was a crisp autumn evening when I arrived at the cabin by the lake. The drive had been long, winding through dense woods that gradually swallowed the last remnants of civilization behind me. I had rented the place for a weekend, hoping to escape the relentless noise of the city and find some peace in nature. The cabin itself was small but well-maintained, a single-story wooden structure with a covered porch that faced the calm, reflective waters of the lake. The trees surrounding it stood tall and ancient, their leaves turning vibrant shades of red and orange. The scent of damp earth and pine filled the air, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of birds. I parked my car on the gravel driveway and carried my bags inside. The interior was cozy, warm wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a modest kitchen, and a bedroom with a single window that overlooked the lake. I had no plans for the weekend beyond reading, hiking, and enjoying the quiet. After settling in, I made myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the water. It was beautiful, almost unreal in its tranquility. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the treeline, I noticed something peculiar. A faint sound drifted through the air, so soft that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it at first. A melody, slow and melancholic, played somewhere in the distance. I frowned, listening more intently. The sound was faint but distinct, like an old gramophone playing a song from a forgotten era. It was coming from the woods beyond the lake. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe there was another cabin on the far side of the trees, and someone was playing music. But the idea didn't sit right with me. The melody had an eerie, almost ghostly quality to it, as though it were coming from somewhere much farther away than it should have. The music continued for a few more minutes before fading into silence. I waited, straining my ears, but it didn't return. With a shake of my head, I dismissed it as my imagination and went inside for the night. The next day was uneventful. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, enjoying the fresh air and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I found no signs of other cabins or people. It seemed like I had the entire area to myself. By evening, I had almost forgotten about the strange melody. I built a small fire outside and roasted some marshmallows, watching as the flames flickered against the darkening sky. Then, just as the night fully settled in, I heard it again. The same haunting tune, drifting from the woods. This time, I was sure I wasn't imagining it. The melody was clearer than before, as if it had moved closer. My skin prickled. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The song was old, the kind of music you'd hear in black and white films. Something played on a gramophone in a grand, empty ballroom. It was beautiful, but there was something profoundly unsettling about it. A deep, gut-level instinct told me that I shouldn't be hearing it. That no one should. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to scan the trees. The forest beyond my cabin was dense, filled with shadows that twisted and shifted in the dim light. The music played on, but I couldn't see any source. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. A chill ran down my spine. I turned and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Morning brought a sense of calm, but it was fragile. I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation. Maybe a hunter or camper had brought an old radio into the woods. Maybe sound traveled in strange ways out here. But a part of me knew better. After breakfast, I decided to investigate. I followed the direction from which the music had come, weaving through trees and stepping over fallen logs. The forest was dense, the air still. Every so often, I paused, half expecting to hear the melody again. After about an hour of walking, I found something that made my stomach drop. Sitting in a small clearing, covered in moss and leaves, was an old gramophone. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. It was ancient, its brass horn tarnished and rusted. The wooden base was weathered, the crank handle barely intact. It looked like it had been sitting there for decades. But that wasn't the worst part. The record on the turntable was still spinning. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was no electricity, no person in sight. And yet, the gramophone was playing a song I could no longer hear. I turned and ran. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, but fear lingered in the back of my mind. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself to stay. It was just an old, broken gramophone. It couldn't hurt me. That night, I locked the doors and windows, determined to ignore whatever happened. But just as I started to drift off, the music returned. This time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was right outside my cabin. The haunting melody seeped through the walls, slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, peering through the blinds. My breath caught. There, at the edge of my porch, stood the gramophone. It hadn't been there when I locked up. I was certain of that. The turntable was spinning, but no needle touched the record. The music played anyway. I stumbled back, heart pounding. This wasn't possible. Someone had to be playing a trick on me. But deep down, I knew that no one was there. The song played on, stretching the night into eternity. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I passed out. I woke to silence. For a long moment, I stayed still, afraid to move. When I finally gathered the courage, I crept to the window. The gramophone was gone. I rushed outside. The porch was empty, the woods still. There was no sign that anything had been there at all. I didn't question it. I packed my things and left, driving away without looking back. Weeks passed, and I tried to push the experience out of my mind. But some nights, just as I was about to fall asleep, I would hear it, faint and distant, as though carried by the wind. A haunting melody, calling me back to the woods. There's something unsettling about being deep in the woods, where civilization feels like a distant memory. You tell yourself you're safe, that the trees and the wind are all that surround you, but sometimes you get the sense that something else is out there, watching. I've been hunting since I was a kid. Grew up in Montana, where the land stretches wide and empty, where you can walk for miles without seeing another soul. My cousin Mike and I always made it a tradition to take a week-long hunting trip every winter, renting an old cabin up in the mountains. It was remote, basic, just 2 cots, a wood stove, and no electricity. Exactly the way we liked it. We'd been to this particular spot 3 times before, and nothing weird had ever happened. It was just another hunting trip. Until it wasn't. The first few days went by without a hitch. We tracked a few deer, set up some bait, spent the evenings cooking over the fire. At night, the wind howled through the trees, but that was normal in the mountains. On the 3rd night, I woke up suddenly. It took me a second to realize what had disturbed me. The wind had stopped. The air was still, too still. It was the kind of silence that makes you uneasy, like the whole forest is holding its breath. Then I heard it. A snap. A branch breaking somewhere outside. I turned my head toward the window, squinting into the darkness. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows through the trees, but I couldn't see anything moving. Probably a deer, I told myself. Or maybe an elk. But something fell off. Another snap. Closer this time. Deliberate. I reached over and nudged Mike. He groaned, half asleep. "Someone's outside," I whispered. That got his attention. He sat up, listening. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Just that eerie silence pressing against the cabin. Then we heard it. A soft tap-tap against the side of the cabin. Mike grabbed his rifle, and I reached for my flashlight. We weren't the kind of guys to get spooked easily, but we'd also heard enough stories to know that being cautious wasn't a bad idea. I clicked the flashlight on and shined it through the window. At first, I didn't see anything. Just trees. Snow. The clearing in front of the cabin was empty. Then I saw it. Deep in the tree line, just at the edge of the light's reach, a figure. It was standing perfectly still. Not moving, not reacting to the light. Just watching. A man. Maybe. But something about the way it stood there, half hidden in the shadows, made my stomach twist. "Who the hell is that?" Mike whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know." I opened the window just a crack. "Hey, who's out there?" Silence. The figure didn't move. Didn't answer. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it stepped back, just a single slow step, disappearing into the trees. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We locked the door, checked our rifles, and took turns keeping watch. Every so often, I'd glance toward the tree line, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the forest. By dawn, we told ourselves it was probably some drifter, maybe a lost hiker. Someone who saw our cabin and decided to keep their distance. But that didn't explain the way he stood there. Watching. Silent. We decided to check the area after sunrise, just to be sure. There were footprints in the snow. Large ones. Leading from the tree line to our cabin, stopping just outside the wall where we'd heard the tapping. No prints leading away. We had 2 more nights in the cabin, and I won't lie, I wanted to leave early. But Mike convinced me to stay. Said it was probably nothing. Said we had our rifles, and that we weren't going to let some weirdo ruin our trip. I wasn't so sure. That night, we triple-checked the locks. We made sure the fire was going strong, and we kept our guns within reach. At around midnight, I woke up again. Not from a noise. Not from a dream. Just woke up, like something had pulled me from sleep. The room was pitch dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire. I listened, and then I heard it. A slow, deep breathing. Not mine. Not Mike's. Outside the window. I turned my head slowly. And there, pressed against the glass, a face. I barely bit back a yell. My heart slammed against my ribs as I scrambled for my rifle. But by the time I turned back, it was gone. Mike woke up to me swearing under my breath. What? What happened? I told him. We both sat there, staring at the window, the cold creeping into our bones. We didn't sleep at all after that. At first light, we packed up. We weren't staying another night. As we loaded up our gear, I took one last look around the cabin, and that's when I saw them. More footprints, circling the cabin, multiple sets. Whoever, or whatever, had been out there wasn't alone. We hiked back to our truck in silence. The whole way down, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing there. Watching. When we got back to town, we stopped at the general store to grab some coffee before heading home. The old guy behind the counter saw the look on our faces and asked if we were all right. We told him what had happened, told him about the footprints, the tapping, the face in the window. He just shook his head. Y'all aren't the first to see him. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? I asked. He hesitated, then sighed. Couple years back, some folks rented that same cabin. Said they saw a man in the woods. Tall. Silent. Just watching. Mike and I exchanged a look. Who is he? Mike asked. The old man just shrugged. No one knows. I pressed him further, but he wouldn't say anything else. We left that day and never went back. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that face in the window, the silent figure standing in the trees, and I wonder if, somewhere deep in those woods, he's still watching, waiting. I've always preferred renting small, secluded cabins over staying in hotels when going on vacation. There's something peaceful about being away from everything. No city noise, no people crowding the streets, no distractions. Just nature, quiet, and fresh air. That's why my girlfriend Anna and I booked a remote cabin in upstate New York for a weekend getaway. It was an older place, built sometime in the 1950s, but from the pictures, it looked well-maintained, rustic, with a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and beautiful forest views. The listing mentioned it was a family-owned property, passed down for generations, and that it had plenty of charm. It sounded perfect. The drive took us nearly 5 hours from the city. As we got closer, the roads turned from asphalt to gravel, winding deeper into the woods. Cell service dropped completely about 30 minutes before we arrived. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I saw the cabin in person for the first time. It was exactly as the photos had shown, quaint but sturdy, nestled among towering pines. The front porch had a wooden swing, and there was a pile of neatly stacked firewood beside the door. The place looked inviting, despite its age. Anna smiled as she stepped out of the car and stretched. I love it already, she said. I agreed. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. I wish I had been right. Inside, the cabin was cozy but simple. The floors creaked under our steps, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The living area had a stone fireplace and a couch with faded cushions. A small kitchen sat to the right, stocked with the basics. There were 2 bedrooms down the hall, both with heavy wooden doors and thick curtains that blocked out the late afternoon sun. Anna wandered around, checking things out while I brought in our bags. Hey, she called from the kitchen. There's a welcome note. I walked over and read it with her. It was handwritten on a small piece of paper. Welcome. Hope you enjoy your stay. If you need anything, call the number in the guest book. P.S. Sometimes the floorboards shift when it gets cold. Don't be alarmed. I didn't think much of it at the time. Old cabins creaked. It was just part of their character. We spent the rest of the evening settling in, cooking dinner, and sitting out on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, nothing but the stillness of the woods around us. It was nice. We went to bed around 11. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The room was completely dark, and for a few moments, I just lay there listening. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, not from outside, where the wind occasionally stirred the trees, but from inside the cabin. It wasn't the normal settling noises of an old house. It was too deliberate. Anna was still asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. I held my breath, straining to pinpoint the noise. It came again, a soft shifting of weight on wood, like someone adjusting their stance. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from the bedroom. It was coming from somewhere beneath us. The crawl space. I listened for what felt like an eternity, but the sound didn't repeat. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the floor settling, like the note had said. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I stepped into the kitchen to make coffee. That's when I noticed something strange. The small trapdoor in the floor, barely visible under the kitchen table, was slightly ajar. It was a tiny thing, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, likely leading to a crawl space for plumbing or storage. I hadn't noticed it the night before, but now, as I stared at it, I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. It hadn't been open yesterday. I crouched down, staring at the gap. It was subtle, just an inch or so, but enough that I could see the darkness beneath. I nudged it shut with my foot. Anna walked in, rubbing her eyes. "Morning," she murmured, heading for the coffee pot. I hesitated. "Did you open that?" I gestured at the trapdoor. She glanced down, frowning. "What?" "No. I didn't even notice it." I forced a chuckle. "Probably just shifted on its own." She nodded, already half distracted, and I let it go. But a strange unease settled in my chest. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Not loud, obvious noises, just the faintest creaks, like something shifting underneath us. At one point, Anna stirred beside me. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if she could see me in the dark. "Just the house settling," I said, though I didn't believe it. Eventually, the sounds stopped, and exhaustion won out. Morning came, and for a while, everything felt normal again. We spent the day hiking and exploring, trying to ignore the lingering unease from the night before. When we got back, I checked the trapdoor again. Still shut. I told myself we'd just been imagining things, that our minds were playing tricks on us in the silence of the woods. That night, I locked every door and window before we went to bed. At around 3 a.m., I woke up again. I don't know what roused me this time, but something felt wrong. The room was dead silent. Not even the usual creaks of the old wood. Then, in the stillness, I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Coming from below. For a few seconds, I froze, heart pounding. Then I carefully, slowly, reached over and shook Anna awake. She stirred groggily. "What?" I put a finger to my lips. "Listen," I whispered. She held still, and the moment stretched on in heavy silence. Then, a faint, deliberate exhale. She stiffened beside me. We weren't imagining it. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, we packed our bags as fast as we could. I didn't check the trapdoor again. I didn't want to know. We left within the hour. As soon as we reached a town with service, I called the number in the guest book. An older man answered. I told him about the noises, about the breathing, about the trapdoor being open. There was a long silence. Then he sighed. "Yeah," he said. "I keep sealing that damn thing, but it always gets opened again." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then, "You're not the first to tell me that. I don't know who, or what, was under that cabin. I don't know if it was just some squatter, someone using the crawl space as shelter, or if it was something worse. All I know is, I'll never stay in another remote cabin again." 2 years ago, my brother and I decided to take a camping trip deep in the remote forests of Oregon. We wanted to get away from the usual crowded campsites, away from people, away from noise. Just a few days of isolation, fishing, and hiking. Nothing but us, nature, and the wilderness. We planned carefully, bringing enough food, water, and supplies for 3 days. My brother, Chris, was more experienced in the outdoors than I was. He had been hiking and camping for years, even did some solo trips. I, on the other hand, was more of a casual camper. I liked the experience, but I never strayed too far from official trails or campsites. This trip would be my first time truly off the grid. We parked the truck at the edge of a rough dirt road, the last place vehicles could go before the forest swallowed everything. From there, it was a long hike in, about 6 miles, to a spot Chris had found on a satellite map. He said there was a clearing with a water source nearby, the perfect place to set up. The hike was brutal. The Oregon wilderness was thick with underbrush, fallen trees, and steep inclines that made every step a challenge. The deeper we went, the more we realized how completely alone we were. No signs of people, no trails, no footprints, nothing. Just endless trees and the sound of wind rustling through the branches. After about 4 hours of hiking, the terrain finally leveled out. That's when we saw it, the cabin. It sat in the middle of a clearing, old and weathered. The wood was darkened with age, the roof sagging slightly. It wasn't a large cabin, just a simple one-room structure, probably built decades ago. There were no lights, no signs of recent use. The windows were filthy, covered in dust and grime, and the front door was slightly ajar. Chris and I exchanged a look. We hadn't expected to find something like this out here. "Think anyone lives here?" I asked. Chris shook his head. Not likely. Look at it. That place hasn't been maintained in years. Still, I felt uneasy. There was something about the cabin that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just that it looked abandoned. It was the feeling it gave off. Like it didn't want us there. Chris, being the more adventurous one, walked right up to the door and pushed it open with the end of his boot. It creaked loudly, echoing through the trees. Inside, the cabin was almost empty. Just a few pieces of broken furniture, an old metal stove, and a wooden table covered in dust. The air smelled stale, like damp wood and rot. No sign of squatters, Chris said, stepping inside. Looks like no one's been here in a long time. I stayed by the doorway, peering in but not stepping inside. Something about it felt wrong, like we were trespassing on something we shouldn't be. We should set up camp outside, I said, away from the cabin. Chris shrugged. Fine by me. We picked a spot about 50 yards away, near the tree line, close enough to the cabin to keep an eye on it, but far enough that I felt a little more comfortable. We set up our tent, built a small fire, and cooked dinner as the sun started to set. For a while, everything felt normal. Peaceful, even. We sat by the fire, talking about random things, work, relationships, old camping trips. The forest around us was quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. But as night fell, that uneasy feeling crept back in. It started around midnight. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was walking just outside our tent. At first, I thought it was Chris, but when I turned over, I saw him still lying in his sleeping bag. His breathing was steady, deep. He was asleep. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled our tent, moving slowly, carefully. Not an animal. Too heavy, too purposeful. Then they stopped. Silence. I stayed completely still, heart pounding. I wanted to wake Chris, but I was too afraid to move. Then I heard it, the sound of the cabin door creaking open. I felt cold all over. The door had been shut when we left it. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear. A few moments passed, then nothing. Just the wind outside. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to close my eyes and willed myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to Chris shaking my shoulder. "Dude," he said, his voice low. "Look at the cabin." I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and followed his gaze. The door to the cabin was wide open. "I shut it last night," Chris said.